Everyone called him a corpse, dressed up as son, a nobleman's son. They had no idea the corpse used to end wars. He stood in the middle of a tournament ring built for lesser men, hands resting in his pockets, watching an undefeated fighter charge at him with a spear made of solidified dragon breath. The favorite's name was Athena. She had never lost a match in her life. She was about to lose this one in under 4 seconds, and she would not understand how. Because the boy in front of her was not a boy. He was the thing that once wore an entire kingdom's death toll like a coat. A weapon built by a god, sharpened by centuries of war, and now folded into the small, unimpressive body of a disgraced noble's firstborn son. He had killed his own family with these hands once. He had taken his own life to make it stop. And somehow, impossibly, he had been given a second chance to do everything differently. That story didn't start here, in this ring, with a spear splintering against a sword that barely moved. It started years earlier, in the dark. Damien Haxon woke up screaming inside a body that could not have been his. His hands were small. His fingers didn't ache the way they always ached. That old bone-deep throb from 1,000 battles. He lay still for a long moment, chest heaving, sweat cooling against sheets that smelled like lavender instead of blood. The last thing he remembered was killing a god, not metaphorically. Not in some poetic, storyteller's sense. He had driven a blade made from his own severed arm through the chest of the Archlich Dorgo, the being who had stolen his mind, his will, and his hands, and used all three to slaughter everyone he had ever loved. He remembered his sister's face in the moment before he ended her. He remembered not being able to stop his own arm from moving. He remembered, at the very end, turning that same weapon on himself, because there was nothing left in the world worth living for. And now birds were singing outside a window he hadn't seen in 20 years. He sat up slowly, small hands, a child's wrists, a room he recognized instantly, though it took his mind a moment longer to catch up. His childhood bedroom, in the crumbling manor of House Haxon, back when the walls still had all their paint, and his father still looked at him without contempt. He didn't call for anyone. He didn't cry out. He got up, walked to a cracked stone in the courtyard that he remembered from a training exercise decades in his future, and drove 2 fingers into it with a technique so old he'd nearly forgotten its name. The stone split down the middle with a sound like a snapped spine. His breath caught. Not because the stone broke. Of course it broke. He could have shattered a mountain with that same motion in his old body. But because it broke at all. His strength was still in him. Diminished. Buried under a decade of childhood weakness. But present. Real. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't dead. He had gone back. The first thing he did after that was find his sister. Louise was 11 years old in this life, curled up on a windowsill with a book she wasn't really reading, and when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her whole face changed. Not with fear. With relief, the kind an anxious younger sibling wears when an older one finally comes to check on them. "You're not going to hit me for being in your room," she said, half a question. He didn't answer right away. He was too busy remembering another version of her. Grown, broken, dragged by the hair through a hallway by a man who considered her a possession. That memory belonged to a future that hadn't happened yet in this timeline. It might never happen. He intended to make sure of it. "No," he finally said. "I'm not going to hit you for anything." She blinked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. That was the shape of the man Damien Haxon had been, in the life before this one. A drunk, a disappointment, a young lord who spent his father's coin on liquor and humiliation, who had let his fiancée walk away laughing while another man beat him bloody in front of a crowd, who had contributed nothing to the world except the space he occupied in it. He remembered all of it now, layered underneath the memory of becoming something far worse, the empty vessel a lich god used to erase an entire bloodline. He was done being either of those men. His father found him an hour later, in the training yard, running through forms that no apprentice knight in the kingdom would recognize. Pauldas Haxon was not a gentle man. Years of watching his eldest son squander every advantage he'd been given had worn any patience out of him completely. And when he saw Damien moving through unfamiliar sword stances with his old, cheap practice blade, his first instinct was fury. "Drop that," Paul snapped. "You'll embarrass this house even standing still. Don't make it worse." Damien lowered the blade and turned to face him. And for the first time in longer than either of them could count, he didn't argue back. He didn't sneer. He didn't offer some smug excuse designed to deflect blame onto anyone but himself. You're right, Damien said. I've been worthless. That changes today. Paul stared at him like he'd grown a second head. He raised a hand, old habit, the kind of gesture a father throws out reflexively after years of disappointment. And Damien didn't flinch, didn't dodge, didn't even lift a hand to block it. He simply stood there and let his father decide what to do with that raised fist. Paul didn't swing. His hand hovered there, trembling slightly, and something in his son's calm, steady eyes made him lower it instead. He'd expected excuses. He'd expected the same tired routine. What he got instead was silence, and an apology with nothing attached to it. No request for money, no plea for forgiveness, just a flat acceptance of guilt that unsettled him more than any insult could have. Louise's mother rushed out at the sound of raised voices and found her husband standing frozen, staring at their son like he'd never met him before. I mean it, Damien said quietly. I'm going to fix what I broke. Nobody in that yard believed him yet. He didn't need them to. He only needed time. He spent the following days remembering things his family had never told him and never would. The way his past life self had wasted a fortune at gambling tables, the debts left unpaid, the arranged engagement to a merchant's daughter named Sophia Russell that had ended in public disgrace when she abandoned him at his lowest and stood by, unmoved, as her new fiancé beat him bloody in the street. He remembered the humiliation of that day with total clarity. Every laugh from the crowd, every word Sophia hadn't bothered to say in his defense. He wasn't angry about it anymore. He'd lived and died 100 lifetimes past that pain. What mattered now was smaller and sharper, protecting the people still in front of him, before the world found new ways to take them from him. The first of those people to need protecting worked in his own house. Victor had served the Haxon family since before Damien was born, a lanky, easily startled man who had spent years absorbing his young lord's worst behavior with a kind of long-suffering loyalty that bordered on saintly. When Damien told him they were walking into the roughest tavern in the lower district to apologize for an unpaid debt, Victor's face went the color of old parchment. Apologize, Victor repeated. You want to apologize to the Black Snake's Tavern, the one where the last noble who owed them money came home with 3 fewer fingers. I owe them an apology, and I owe them coin, Damien said. I intend to pay both. Victor followed anyway, muttering the entire walk about early graves and ungrateful employers, because that was what loyalty looked like on him, complaining loudly while never once considering leaving. The tavern smelled like spilled ale and old smoke, and the men inside it noticed the Haxon crest on Damien's collar before they noticed his face. One of them, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, sauntered over with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost a fight in this particular room. Well, well, the enforcer said. The little lordling finally grew a spine. He said something about Louise next. Something crude, something meant to needle, the kind of comment designed to see how far a nobleman's patience would stretch before he either fled or made a fool of himself trying to defend it. He never finished the sentence. Damien's blade moved once, faster than the eye could track in a body this young, and the enforcer's hand hit the floorboards before the rest of him understood what had happened. The scream that followed brought every drinker in the tavern to their feet. Victor made a noise like a kettle reaching boil. Damien didn't raise his voice. I came here to apologize. I'll still do that, but no one speaks about my sister that way and keeps the hand they said it with. An apprentice knight stationed at the tavern, a stiff young man named Ted who fancied himself the muscle of the operation, drew his sword and demanded Damien stand down. Damien watched the opening 2 seconds of Ted's stance, absorbed the shape of his technique the way he'd absorbed hundreds of techniques in a life this body hadn't lived yet, and disarmed him with the same motion Ted had planned to use on him. Ted hit the ground and stayed there, more confused than hurt. The bar owner came out from behind the counter with his hands raised, already offering gold, already apologizing for debts and insults he hadn't personally caused. Damien took the coin. Then, calmly, he took something else. A small cut along the man's ear, a shallow warning wound that would scar just enough to be remembered. Tell whoever runs this operation that House Haxon isn't a debt to collect anymore, Damien said. Tell them I said so. Victor didn't speak again until they were 3 streets away, and when he finally did, his voice came out strangled. You cut off a man's ear. I cut a very small piece of it, Damien said. He'll live. Everyone in that room will remember why they should leave my family alone. That's worth more than the coin. Victor didn't argue. He simply stared at his young lord with the dawning, uneasy realization that whatever had happened to Damien recently, it had rewritten him at the root. The tavern's owner reported everything to his employer that same night, and the man who ran the Black Snake Syndicate in that district, a cold, calculating figure named Cedric Walker, listened to the account with growing irritation. A noble's son had walked into his territory and dismantled 2 of his men without breaking a sweat. That wasn't a message he could ignore. Cedric had the apprentice knight Ted quietly disposed of for the failure, a brutal, wordless lesson to anyone else who might hesitate to act, and put out a call for something sharper than muscle. He needed a specialist. He needed someone from Yulon. Word of a dark mage assassin accepting the contract didn't reach the Haxon estate for several days. Before it could, a different threat arrived at their front gate entirely. Erwin Lion Bloom came dressed in his family's colors, flanked by 2 attendants and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the son of one of the most powerful noble houses in the region, and he had come, he announced grandly, to formalize a marriage proposal to Louise Haxon. He framed it as generosity. He mentioned, almost as an aside, the humiliating scene Damien had caused at a recent banquet. A drunken, reckless spectacle from before the regression, one that had left House Haxon's reputation hanging by threads. Marrying Louise into House Lion Bloom, Erwin suggested, would repair that damage and secure the family's future. All they had to do was say yes. Damien remembered this man, not from this timeline, from the one he'd lived through as a helpless passenger inside his own body, watching a version of Louise get dragged by her hair down a hallway, while this same smiling monster screamed at her for some invented failure. He remembered arriving too late to stop it. He remembered the sound she made. Louise, not knowing any of that, straightened her spine and offered herself up anyway, quietly, bravely, the way she always did when she thought it would spare her family further shame. "I'll go," she said. "If it helps the family, I'll go." Something in Damien's chest went very still and very cold. He crossed the courtyard in 4 steps and drove his fist directly up into Erwin Lion Bloom's jaw, with enough force to lift the man clean off the ground. Erwin sailed backward through the air, arms flailing, and landed hard against the courtyard's low garden wall, dazed and sputtering, blood running from a split lip. The attendants froze. Louise's hands flew to her mouth. Somewhere behind them, their mother made a small, horrified sound. "She's not going anywhere," Damien said, flexing his fist like the punch hadn't cost him anything at all. "And you're going to leave my family's home before I decide that wasn't enough." Erwin staggered upright, humiliation flushing his face a deep red. He wasn't used to being struck, let alone by a man his own circles considered a useless drunk. He demanded satisfaction. He demanded a formal duel, sword against sword, to settle the insult in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to every noble house in the region. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, just slightly, and asked for a fork instead. Erwin's face went through several colors before settling on a deep, furious red. "A fork." The word landed in the courtyard like an insult heavier than the punch that preceded it. "You mock me," he said. "I'm giving you exactly what you're worth," Damien answered. "If that offends you, back out of the duel now, and everyone here will remember that too." Pride wouldn't let him. Erwin straightened his jacket, wiped the blood from his lip, and agreed through gritted teeth, already imagining how satisfying it would feel to carve this arrogance out of a disgraced drunk in front of his own family. Word of a formal duel between House Haxon and House Lion Bloom spread through the district faster than either family could control. By the time the appointed morning arrived, a modest crowd had gathered along the low stone fence separating the Haxon training yard from the road. Servants, a few curious nobles, and Victor, standing near the front, with his hands pressed so tightly together his knuckles had gone white. Erwin arrived in polished armor, a well-balanced longsword resting easily in his grip, every inch the image of a knight in training who had never once doubted his own superiority. Damien arrived holding a plain dining fork, borrowed that morning from the kitchen, still faintly smelling of breakfast. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Erwin's own attendants didn't bother hiding their smirks. "Last chance to apologize," Erwin said, raising his sword into a clean opening stance. "I'll make it quick regardless." "Take your time," Damien said. "I'm not in a hurry." Erwin struck first, a fast diagonal cut meant to end the humiliation before it truly began. Damien didn't dodge. He simply turned the fork half an inch, caught the flat of the blade against one tine, and redirected the entire strike a hair's breadth wide of his shoulder. The motion looked almost lazy. Erwin's momentum carried him half a step past his target, and for one confused second, his mind refused to process what his eyes had just seen. He recovered and swung again, faster, angrier. Damien caught that strike too, this time letting the fork slide along the length of the blade with a screech of metal that made several onlookers wince. He stepped inside Erwin's guard as he did it, close enough to feel the other man's breath, and tapped him lightly on the sternum with 2 fingers. Erwin stumbled back like he'd been hit by a hammer. "You're fighting like every blow needs to end me," Damien said, almost conversational. "That's the problem. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. You've only ever had to win." Something in that observation cut deeper than any wound could have. Erwin roared and abandoned technique altogether, swinging in wide, undisciplined arcs meant to overwhelm through sheer force. Damien read every motion before it finished forming. The ghost of 10,000 duels fought in another lifetime, guiding a body too young to have earned this skill honestly. He slipped each strike by inches, let the sword's edge kiss past his ear, his shoulder, his ribs, close enough that the crowd gasped every time, and never once let the blade actually connect. By the 5th exchange, Erwin was breathing hard, and Damien hadn't moved his feet more than a stride in any direction. The finishing blow came almost gently. Erwin lunged with everything he had left, a full-body thrust aimed at Damien's chest, betting his entire pride on one clean strike. Damien sidestepped, let the sword pass an inch from his ribs, and drove the fork forward in a short, precise jab that caught Erwin directly in the side of the throat. Not deep, not lethal, just enough for 4 small punctures to well up with blood along his collar, enough that every person watching understood exactly how easily that fork could have found his windpipe instead. Erwin froze completely. The sword slipped from his fingers and clattered against the stone. "You could kill me," he said, voice cracking, more statement than question. "I could have killed you 3 exchanges ago," Damien said, lowering the fork. "I'm choosing not to. Remember that, the next time you think about touching my sister." Erwin nodded so fast it looked painful. All his earlier arrogance evaporated, replaced by a trembling, genuine fear that hadn't existed in him an hour before. His attendants half carried him back toward their carriage, while the gathered crowd stood in stunned silence, then began, slowly, to whisper. By nightfall, the story of the Haxon heir who'd defeated a lion bloom noble with a dinner fork had already outraced any carriage that could carry it. Paul found his son afterward in the training yard, still holding the fork, turning it over in his hands like it was any ordinary object, rather than the thing that had just rewritten his family's standing in the district. His father didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he walked into the house and came back out carrying his own sword, an old, well-kept blade that had belonged to him since before Damien was born. "Take it," Paul said, holding it out. "You've clearly outgrown the practice weapon." Damien accepted it with both hands, and something in his chest, some old, guarded thing that hadn't fully believed his father could look at him without contempt again, finally loosened. Louise hugged him that night without saying a single word about the duel, just held on to him the way she used to when they were small, before everything had gone wrong the first time around. He let her. He didn't tell her why it meant so much to him. He didn't tell her about the version of her he'd failed to save. 3 nights later, something else came for the family instead. Damien woke before dawn to a wrongness in the air, a faint, oily pressure against his senses that he recognized instantly from another lifetime spent fighting things that used exactly this kind of magic. Dark mana, close. Inside the house, he moved through the halls in absolute silence and found the source outside Louise's door. A shape pressed flat against the wall in the shadows, cloaked, motionless, watching the gap beneath her door like a predator deciding when to strike. Damien didn't hesitate. He lunged. The figure reacted with unnatural speed, twisting away from his grip and vaulting through the nearest window in a single fluid motion. By the time Damien reached the courtyard, the intruder was already over the wall and gone, leaving behind nothing but a lingering trail of dark mana clinging to the grass like frost. He followed the trail as far as the stables and found what the intruder had left there, one of the family's horses, dead, its body drained and gray, skin stretched thin over a frame that looked like it had aged 50 years in a single night. Whatever had touched Louise's door had needed to feed on something first, and it had chosen the easiest life available. Damien knelt beside the animal, jaw tight, and made a promise to it that he intended to keep. He spent the following 2 days tracking the residue of that dark mana through the district, following a trail invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a previous lifetime learning to read exactly this kind of corruption. It led him, eventually, to an abandoned mill on the edge of town, its windows boarded, its air thick with the same oily wrongness he'd sensed outside his sister's door. He went in alone. Victor had wanted to come. Damien had left him behind on a pretext, unwilling to risk him against something built entirely out of forbidden magic. The mill's interior had been gutted and refitted into something closer to a ritual chamber. Dark sigils scrawled across the walls in dried blood, candles burned down to stubs on every surface. The mage himself stood waiting near the center of the room, robed, gaunt, his eyes carrying the faint, sickly glow that marked a soul that had traded pieces of itself for power. "You found me faster than expected," the mage said. "The Black Snake said you were an untrained noble's brat. They were wrong, weren't they?" "They were very wrong," Damien said. The mage struck first, hurling a curse designed to rot flesh from bone on contact, the kind of spell that had ended entire garrisons in the war, Damien remembered from his old life. It splashed against him and simply vanished, absorbed into the mark burned into his hand, the authority of greed drinking down every trace of dark magic aimed his way like it had been starving for it. The mage's confidence cracked. He summoned something larger next, a hulking, half-formed shape wreathed in black flame, a hellfire construct meant to overwhelm through sheer destructive force. Damien walked toward it without slowing, let the flames wash over him, and absorbed that too, the fire guttering out mid-roar as if it had never existed. "What are you?" the mage whispered, backing away now, robes tangling around his legs. Damien didn't answer with words. He answered by closing the distance in a single stride and driving a soul-severing slash through the space where the mage's magic anchored itself to his body. The technique didn't kill quickly. It unraveled, cutting the thread between soul and spell with surgical precision, until the mage collapsed to his knees, gasping, every ounce of stolen power stripped away in an instant. "Black Snake sent you to watch my sister's window," Damien said, crouching in front of him. "Tell me why, and tell me where their headquarters is, and I'll let the church deal with you instead of doing it myself." The man talked. Men like him always talked, once the power that made them brave had been taken away. Damien left the mill with a severed head wrapped in cloth, a grimoire tucked under one arm, and a location burned into his memory. He handed both off to Victor the next morning with instructions to deliver them to the nearest chapel of the Holy Church, an errand Victor accepted with visible relief at finally being given a task that didn't involve standing near active violence. He did not expect what walked back out of that chapel to introduce herself. She wore the robes of a low-ranking sister at first glance, humble, unremarkable, easy to overlook in a crowded street. But the moment she lifted the grimoire from Victor's shaking hands and murmured a single verifying incantation over it, her posture changed entirely. Spine straightening, presence sharpening, the quiet authority of someone whose true rank had been hiding in plain sight. "Agnes," she said, introducing herself properly. "First apprentice of the Azure Flame." Victor, to his credit, only fainted a little. Agnes requested to see the young lord responsible for the delivery, and when Damien arrived to meet her in person, she studied him with an intensity that made even him briefly reconsider how well he'd hidden himself. Her eyes lingered on the faint traces of absorbed dark mana still clinging to his aura, subtle enough that most trained knights would miss it entirely. "An apprentice knight couldn't have done what's described in that grimoire's notes," she said carefully. "Neither could most official knights." "I got lucky," Damien said. "You got lucky twice," Agnes replied, "against a Yulan-trained assassin who's evaded church hunters for 2 years." She didn't press further, though he could see the question sitting behind her eyes, patient and unspoken. "The church will act on this information immediately. Black Snake's governor-backed operation ends today." She was true to her word. By evening, church-sanctioned paladins moved through the district in coordinated force, and Damien, unwilling to sit at home while the syndicate that had threatened his family got dismantled by someone else's hands, walked directly into Black Snake's headquarters alone. The guards posted at the entrance lasted less than a minute between them. He moved through the building with the same unhurried efficiency he'd shown in every fight since his return, disarming, breaking, subduing, never once drawing his father's sword from its sheath. By the time he reached the top floor, the governor secretly bankrolling the entire operation was already backed into a corner, sweating through an expensive coat, screaming for guards who would never arrive. Cedric Walker, the man who had ordered a dark mage sent after Damien's family, tried to flee through a side passage and found Agnes waiting for him there instead, her paladin's mana crackling faintly along one fist. The governor's personal knight made the mistake of drawing his sword against her. Agnes ended that mistake with a single punch that put him through a support beam. By the time the sun set fully, Cedric Walker knelt in the street in front of a gathering crowd, hands bound. The crime lord who had once controlled half the district's underworld reduced to something small and pathetic in the dust. Damien walked up to him without a word and drove one final punch across his jaw, not out of necessity, but because some debts deserved to be collected in person. "For the horse," Damien said. Agnes watched that with an expression she didn't bother to hide, something between professional disapproval and genuine, helpless admiration. The church, in the following days, formally extended its protection to House Haxon, a status few minor noble families ever received. Agnes herself requested to oversee the arrangement, a task well below her rank that she nonetheless volunteered for without hesitation, and found reasons to visit the Haxon estate more often than the arrangement strictly required. She brought him an advanced cultivation technique on her second visit, a method of channeling mana that took most knights years to properly internalize. Damien absorbed its principles within a single afternoon, executing the forms with a precision that made Agnes stop mid-sentence and simply stare at him across the training yard. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "Not in one day." "I had a very motivated teacher," Damien said, which wasn't quite a lie. She didn't press him on it, though something in the way she watched him after that carried a new kind of attention, warmer, more searching than professional curiosity should allow. Louise noticed it before Damien did, and spent the rest of the week finding excuses to leave the two of them alone in the courtyard. The peace didn't last. 4 days after Agnes granted the Haxon house its new protection, a small envoy from House Lion Bloom arrived at the front gate. Not Erwin this time, still nursing his wounded pride somewhere out of sight, but Garrick, one of Lion Bloom's official knights, flanked by 2 apprentice enforcers, with the look of men sent to correct an insult through force. "The young master demands the boy answer for his conduct," Garrick announced, voice booming across the courtyard. "He'll come with us, willingly or otherwise." Victor, standing near the front steps, made the mistake of telling them to leave. One of the apprentices backhanded him, hard enough to split his lip and drop him to the ground. Paul stepped between the knights and his household without a moment's hesitation, unarmed, furious, fully aware he stood no real chance against an official knight and refusing to move regardless. "You'll go through me first," he said. Garrick smiled the way men smile at obstacles they don't respect. He never got the chance to move past him. Damien crossed the courtyard fast enough that the apprentice knights barely registered him before his sword was already at Garrick's throat, close enough that the official knight froze mid-step, sweat breaking out along his hairline. "You raised a hand to my servant," Damien said quietly, "and you were about to raise one to my father." What followed lasted less than 30 seconds. Damien disarmed Garrick with a motion too fast for the crowd of household staff to properly witness, severed the arm holding his blade with clinical precision, and left the man screaming in the dirt while his 2 apprentices tried and failed to intervene, both put down before they'd finished drawing their weapons. Garrick, cradling the ruin of his arm, begged. Not for mercy in any dignified sense. Genuine, undignified pleading. The kind that came from a man who had walked in expecting an easy victory and left having learned exactly how wrong that assumption had been. "Tell Erwin," Damien said, standing over him, "that if House Lion Bloom sends anyone else to my family's door, I won't be nearly this gentle." He let Victor land a few extra kicks before allowing the knights to be dragged off the property, a small, petty kindness that Victor accepted with the fierce satisfaction of a man who rarely got to strike back at anything. Agnes arrived within the hour, summoned by frightened staff, and formally documented the attack as a violation of church-protected territory, a designation that placed House Lion Bloom under real legal and religious pressure for the first time. Whatever standing Erwin's family held in noble circles, it would not survive an open conflict with the Holy Church. Paul watched his son stand in the courtyard afterward, blood-flecked sword still in hand, and said nothing for a long time. Then he crossed the distance between them and put a hand on Damien's shoulder, firm, steady, entirely unlike the anger that usually lived there. "You did well," Paul said. "You did very well. It should not have meant as much as it did." Damien had heard grander praise in another lifetime, from kings and generals and gods who no longer existed. None of it had ever landed the way those 4 plain words did, standing in his family's courtyard, sword still warm in his hand. The relief didn't last long. 2 days later, a different kind of trouble arrived. Not armed, not violent, but carrying a ledger, a wax-sealed contract, and a debt collector's patient, unbothered smile. The man who arrived that morning introduced himself as Olan Dishi, an agent of House Gold Pixie's lending office, and he carried himself with the practiced calm of someone who had delivered ruinous news to 100 noble families before this one, and expected no trouble doing it again. He laid the ledger across the Haxon's dining table without waiting for an invitation. 300 gold, he said. Borrowed against the eastern wheat fields, 6 months past, under young Lord Haxon's signature. Payment was due at the start of this season. Paul went pale. He hadn't known. Damien, sifting through memories that belonged to a version of himself who'd spent money faster than he'd ever earned any, recognized the debt the moment he heard the number. A drunken loan, taken out to cover gambling losses, secured against the only land that actually fed the household through winter. "We don't have 300 gold, Paul said quietly. "Then House Gold Pixie will begin proceedings to claim the wheat fields as settlement," Olan said, already rolling up the ledger. "Nothing personal. Business is business." Louise's hand found her mother's under the table. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the door closed behind him. Damien didn't panic. Panic belonged to men without options, and he'd spent a lifetime learning how to manufacture options out of nothing. "I'll go to the Duke myself," he said. "You'll what?" Paul said, incredulous. "Duke Gold Pixie doesn't need our fields," Damien said. "He needs something else. Every noble house wants something else. I'll find out what his is." He rode out the next morning with Victor trailing reluctantly behind him, muttering under his breath about how walking into a duke's estate uninvited to renegotiate a defaulted loan sounded less like a plan and more like a creative way to end up in a debtor's cell. Damien ignored him. He'd faced down gods. A moneylender with a title didn't frighten him. Duke Adam Gold Pixie received him in a study lined with maps and ledgers, a lean, sharp-eyed man who had built his family's fortune through patience and leverage, rather than the sword. He listened to Damien's proposal without interrupting, fingers steepled beneath his chin, weighing the offer the way a man weighs any transaction, for what it could get him, not for what it cost the person across the table. Damien's offer was simple. There was a gold mine dispute currently tangled between House Gold Pixie and House Lion Bloom, a contested vein of ore sitting on disputed borderland, and it was scheduled to be settled through a formal knight's duel between representatives of each house. If Damien fought and won on the Duke's behalf, the Haxon debt would be cleared entirely, plus a stipend for the family's continued cooperation. "You're an untested boy with a reputation for drinking, not fighting," the Duke said. "Why would I gamble a valuable mine on you instead of my own knights?" "Because your knights have already lost twice against Lion Bloom's champions," Damien said, "and because I don't lose." The confidence in his voice wasn't bravado. The Duke, who had survived decades of court politics by reading exactly that kind of certainty in other men's eyes, studied him a moment longer and finally nodded. "Prove it first," he said. "One of my own knights will test you before I stake anything real on your name." The knight in question was a mid-class fighter named Horwitz, a lean, grinning man whose reputation rested entirely on a trick spear technique nobody in the region had yet learned to counter. He met Damien in the Duke's private courtyard 2 days later, spear held loose and low, clearly expecting the exhibition to end quickly and in his own favor. "Try not to bleed on the good stones," Horwitz said, almost friendly about it. The fight began fast. Horwitz's spear moved in patterns Damien hadn't encountered before, feints layered inside feints, the weapon seeming to change angle mid-strike in ways that defied normal technique. On the fourth exchange, one of those impossible angles slipped past his guard entirely and opened a shallow line along his forearm, the first real wound Damien had taken since waking up in this second life. Blood welled along the cut. A murmur ran through the small gathered crowd, several of the Duke's retainers exchanging knowing looks. Horwitz's spear had a reputation for finding exactly this kind of opening, and most opponents broke after the first blood drew. Damien didn't break. He didn't even flinch. He absorbed the shape of that opening angle in the half-second it took to land, feeling out the mechanics of the trick the way he'd absorbed hundreds of techniques from opponents who no longer existed in any timeline. The second time Horwitz tried the same feint, Damien's blade was already where the strike would end, not where it began. Horwitz's spear shattered against his sword's return cut, the shock of the impact traveling up through his own arms hard enough to nearly drop him. He stared at the broken weapon in his hands, then at the shallow cut still bleeding along Damien's forearm, and understood, with dawning unease, that his opponent had simply absorbed his entire arsenal in the space of 4 exchanges and thrown it back at him. "Yield," Damien said, sword resting lightly against Horwitz's collarbone. Horwitz yielded. The Duke, watching from the shaded edge of the courtyard, allowed himself the faintest flicker of genuine interest. A boy who could take a wound without breaking stride, absorb an opponent's signature technique in real time, and still choose restraint over a killing blow. That was not the reputation House Haxon's disgraceful son had earned him. "You'll represent me in the mine dispute," the Duke said, "but you'll need to earn your place among my other representatives first. There's a hierarchy here, and I don't hand position to strangers regardless of talent." That hierarchy came in the form of 3 young men the Duke's household staff referred to, half affectionately and half mockingly, as the 3 Stooges, a knight in training named Pavle and his 2 self-declared sworn brothers, loud, undisciplined, and fiercely loyal to one another in the clumsy way young men often are before life teaches them better technique. Pavle challenged Damien openly, convinced that besting the newcomer would secure his own place as the Duke's lead representative. Damien obliged him, and his 2 brothers in the same breath, taking on all 3 at once with deliberately weighted restrictions on his own movement. A handicap he set for himself, not out of arrogance, but because he'd already decided something more useful than victory was available here. He knocked all 3 unconscious within minutes, still holding to his self-imposed restrictions the entire time. Then, once they'd woken groaning and humiliated, he made them an offer instead of gloating over it. "I'll teach you Lionbloom's sword style," he said. "Every counter, every weakness. Your bodies won't know they're being trained against a specific enemy. They'll just know how to win when the moment comes." Pavle, nursing a bruised jaw, squinted up at him with obvious suspicion. "Why would you help us instead of just embarrassing us again next time?" "Because your embarrassment doesn't help me," Damien said. "Your victory in an actual duel does." They trained together for the better part of 2 weeks, grueling, repetitive sessions that left the 3 of them bruised and exhausted every evening, absorbing patterns their conscious minds barely registered, but their muscles were slowly, silently memorizing. Damien said nothing about why he was so specific about certain counters, certain footwork corrections that seemed oddly tailored to Lionbloom's known style. He let them believe it was simply thorough instruction. It was, in truth, a promise he intended to collect on later. The Duke's household received an unwelcome visitor midway through that training period. His own daughter, Chelsea Goldpixie, arriving unannounced with an entourage that included a hulking freelance knight called Gwom, known across the region by the nickname Wild Beast for his brutal, overwhelming fighting style. Chelsea's arrival wasn't a courtesy visit. She'd come to contest Damien's position as her father's champion, convinced her own knight could win the mine dispute more decisively. Gwom offered a strength contest as an opening challenge, gripping the edge of a heavy stone table and daring Damien to match him. Damien flipped the entire table with one hand instead, sending Gwom stumbling backward, and the challenge escalated from there into a formally declared duel between the 2 of them, scheduled for 3 days later. Chelsea approached Damien privately the night before that duel, dressed in something clearly chosen to distract rather than impress, carrying a small vial of incense that shimmered faintly with an unnatural glow. She lit it near him under the pretense of hospitality, watching his reaction with careful, calculating patience. Damien recognized the enchantment the moment it touched the air, an allure compound laced with dark mana, designed to cloud judgment and bend loyalty. He absorbed it the same way he absorbed every dark magic thrown his way, the mark on his hand drinking down the enchantment before it could take root. Chelsea's expression flickered, surprise breaking briefly through her composure. "That shouldn't be possible. A lot of things about me shouldn't be possible," Damien said. "Try something like that again, and I'll make sure your father learns exactly where you're getting enchanted incense from." Her composure cracked further. She threatened his family in response, hissing something about how easily accidents happened to minor noble houses that made enemies of the wrong people. Damien's response was immediate and cold. He crossed the distance between them, gripped her by the throat just firmly enough to make his point without leaving lasting harm, and held her gaze until the threat in her eyes gave way to genuine fear. Then he released her, turned to her guards standing frozen nearby, and drew a shallow line across each of their forearms, with a flick of his blade, before they'd even registered him moving. "That was a warning," he said. "Threaten my family again, and I stop being gentle about it." Chelsea left that night without another word, but the fear in her eyes had settled into something colder and more calculating, the look of someone quietly reassessing every option available to her. The duel against Guam took place the following afternoon in front of the Duke's full household. Guam fought with a brutal, overwhelming style that had clearly been enhanced beyond what natural training could account for, strength and speed that didn't match the fundamentals of his technique. Damien recognized the imbalance immediately. Dark mana, buried deep, disguised well enough to fool most observers. He drew his father's sword and activated the resonance properties of the Thousand League technique, layered into his footwork, sending waves of disruptive vibration through every strike that connected. Guam absorbed the first 2 hits without visible effect. By the third, something inside him began to buckle. The 4th strike broke whatever containment had been hiding the truth. Guam doubled over mid-swing and vomited a thick stream of black sludge across the dueling ring, his body visibly shrinking as the stolen power drained out of him in real time, the artificial muscle and speed evaporating, until what remained was an ordinary, unremarkable man on his knees in front of a stunned crowd. The Duke's face went hard as granite. His daughter's champion, the fighter she'd brought in specifically to undermine his chosen representative, had been enhanced with forbidden magic the entire time. It wasn't a difficult conclusion to reach from there. Chelsea's involvement with the enchanted incense, her recent secretive absences, her sudden confidence in a knight who shouldn't have been able to match a mid-class fighter at all, it painted a picture the Duke couldn't ignore, however much he might have wanted to. He had both Chelsea and Guam arrested that same evening. Damien watched it happen from a distance, no satisfaction in his expression. He'd seen enough of what dark mages did to desperate, overlooked people to recognize the shape of it, even in someone as coldly manipulative as Chelsea Goldpixie. A person starved of her father's attention her whole life, reaching for power through whoever offered it first, regardless of the cost. He didn't yet know how steep that cost would turn out to be. The formal duels between House Goldpixie and House Lionbloom were scheduled for the following week, 3 representatives from each side fighting in sequence, the Goldmine's fate decided by whichever house won the majority. Damien would fight last. Before his turn came, he would need to watch 2 other men risk everything on a contest he had no control over. The morning of the duels arrived cold and overcast, the Duke's private arena packed with nobles from both houses, servants crowded along the outer fences, betting slips changing hands in whispered exchanges, nobody bothered hiding. 3 fights would decide the mine's ownership, 2 houses, 6 men, one outcome that would matter for years. Fabian Vincenzo stepped into the ring first, for House Goldpixie, a competent, disciplined swordsman who had spent the better part of a decade earning his rank the honest way. His opponent, a Lionbloom knight named Ronald, met him with a cold, economical style that wasted no motion and offered no openings. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected, both men trading careful strikes, testing rhythm before committing to anything decisive. Then Ronald found his opening, a feint low, a real strike high, and his blade came down across Fabian's forearm with enough force to sever it cleanly at the elbow. Fabian's scream cut through the crowd. Attendants rushed the ring before he could bleed out, and Ronald stood over him without a flicker of remorse, already turning to accept his house's applause. House Lionbloom, 1-0. Pavle went in next, still carrying the bruises from 2 weeks of relentless training under Damien's instruction, facing a Lionbloom fighter named Hui Silesian, who moved with the same distinct style Damien had spent countless hours drilling into Pavle's reflexes. Hui's opening combination was elegant, fast, the kind of sequence that had ended most of his previous matches within the first exchange. Pavle's body reacted before his mind fully caught up, feet shifting into a counter stance he didn't consciously remember learning, blade rising to intercept an angle he shouldn't have been able to predict. Hui's strike glanced harmlessly aside. Pavlo's counter connected solidly against his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The crowd's murmur shifted from disbelief to genuine excitement. Hui adjusted, tried a second combination, and found the same unnerving result. His signature style, the one he'd spent years perfecting, met with responses that seemed to know exactly where he'd strike before he committed to it. 3 exchanges later, Pavla disarmed him completely, ending the match with his blade resting lightly against Hui's throat. The crowd erupted. Pavla himself looked almost as stunned as his opponent, glancing back toward where Damien stood at the edge of the arena, a slow understanding dawning across his bruised face. Score tied, 1-1. Everything now rested on the final match. Damien stepped into the ring to face Michael Lion Bloom, and the atmosphere across the arena shifted the moment the two of them squared off. Michael was no ordinary representative, the heir to House Lion Bloom itself, a genuine prodigy who had awakened a rare sixth sense at an unusually young age, widely considered one of the strongest fighters of his generation. Michael studied Damien with unmasked curiosity rather than contempt. He'd heard the stories, the fork duel, Garrick's severed arm, Guam's public unraveling, and unlike most of his house, he hadn't dismissed them as exaggeration. "I've wanted a real opponent for a long time," Michael said, settling into a loose, ready stance. "Something tells me I finally found one." "You might regret that," Damien said. Michael attacked with everything he had from the very first exchange. No testing, no careful probing, just an immediate, overwhelming assault of speed and technique that would have ended most fights in seconds. Damien didn't draw his sword. He kept his hands loose at his sides and simply moved, slipping past strike after strike with margins so thin the crowd gasped every time steel passed within inches of his skin. Michael's frustration built with every missed strike, his attacks growing sharper, faster, more desperate to find any opening at all. He was, without question, the most gifted opponent Damien had faced in this body. Fast enough, skilled enough, that dodging alone was beginning to draw genuine effort rather than idle contempt. After nearly 2 full minutes of unbroken assault, Damien finally reached for his sword. What happened next existed somewhere between technique and illusion. Damien's blade moved once, a single motion too fast for the watching crowd to properly track, and Michael's world dissolved into something that felt entirely, viscerally real. The cold bite of steel across his throat, the wet warmth spreading down his collar, his own knees buckling as his vision darkened at the edges. He was dead. He knew he was dead. Every nerve in his body insisted on it. Then the sensation vanished, and Michael found himself standing upright in the arena, whole, unmarked, staring at Damien's sword resting harmlessly at his side. His hand flew to his own throat, fingers searching frantically for a wound that had never actually existed outside his own mind. He dropped to his knees a moment later, not from injury, but from something closer to genuine terror. "I yield," Michael said, voice barely steady. "I yield completely." The Duke's side of the arena erupted into triumphant noise. House Gold Pixie had won the mine dispute 2 matches to 1, and with it, the debt hanging over House Haxon evaporated entirely, along with a substantial stipend the Duke made good on within the week. Michael remained kneeling a moment longer after the noise died down, staring up at Damien with none of his earlier arrogance left in his expression. "What was that?" he said. "What did you show me?" "A possibility," Damien said, offering him a hand up. "One I'd rather neither of us have to see for real. You're strong, Michael. Stronger than almost anyone I've faced in this life. When the real war comes, I'd rather you standing beside me than against me." Michael accepted the hand, something unspoken passing between them in that grip. Respect, wary and new, but genuine. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. The victory should have felt clean. It didn't stay that way for long. 3 days later, word reached the Gold Pixie estate that Chelsea had been found dead in her prison cell, hanged from a length of torn cloth. The official ruling declaring it a suicide, brought on by shame and despair over her impending trial. The Duke received the news in stony, unreadable silence, and if any private grief moved through him, he allowed no one to witness it. The truth, when it surfaced, arrived through darker channels. Whispers moved through Yulan's remaining network within days, insisting Chelsea hadn't taken her own life at all, that she'd been tortured to death on her father's orders, silenced before her trial could expose deeper ties between the Duke and the very dark mage organizations he publicly condemned. Damien didn't know which version was true, and something in him suspected the real answer sat somewhere uglier than either. A young woman, unloved her entire life, manipulated by forces that saw her loneliness as an opening to exploit. discarded the moment she stopped being useful to anyone at all. The dark mages made certain the second version reached exactly the ears they wanted it to reach. A mid-class knight named Ernst, who had genuinely loved Chelsea despite her scheming, despite everything, received the news of her supposed torture through a carefully engineered whisper campaign designed to break him. Grief curdled into rage. Rage made him vulnerable. And vulnerability, to the kind of people orchestrating this from the shadows, was simply another door left open. Damien returned to his own estate in the days that followed. The mine dispute settled, the family debt cleared, and found himself troubled by a feeling he hadn't expected to carry out of this arc. The growing certainty that every victory here was being watched, weighed, and turned into leverage by something far larger operating just outside his line of sight. He didn't have long to sit with that unease. A convoy escort had been arranged to carry him and a small household party back through the forest road toward home. And somewhere along that quiet stretch of trees, the people orchestrating Chelsea's death and Ernst's unraveling grief had already decided the road offered them exactly the opportunity they needed. He rode out at dawn, Victor beside him, unaware that the trees ahead were already full of eyes. The forest closed in thick and quiet around the convoy by mid-morning, sunlight cutting through the canopy in scattered, uneven shafts. Damien noticed the wrongness before anyone else did. Birds gone silent half a mile back, no wind moving through branches that should have been swaying. He'd learned long ago, in a life this body hadn't lived yet, that silence like this rarely meant safety. The first attack came without warning. An escort knight riding point simply dropped from his saddle, throat opened by a blade none of them had seen thrown. Chaos followed instantly, figures dropping from the tree line, dark cloaked and fast, closing on the convoy from 3 directions at once. Damien was off his horse before the second knight fell, already moving toward the center of the ambush. He recognized one face among the attackers immediately, and it was not a stranger's face, Ernst. The knight's eyes carried none of the grief Damien expected. They carried something worse, a hollow, glassy focus, pupils rimmed faintly with the same sickly glow Damien had seen in the dark mage back at the mill. Ernst wasn't fighting out of vengeance anymore. He'd been made into a weapon, whatever remained of the man who'd loved Chelsea buried somewhere beneath layers of foreign compulsion. "Ernst," Damien said, blocking a strike that would have taken an escort's head clean off. "This isn't you. Whoever fed you those lies about her death used you the same way they used her." Ernst didn't answer. He didn't seem capable of it anymore. A second figure emerged from the trees, a woman moving with unnatural grace, trailing a faint perfume that carried its own kind of danger. Rebecca's enchantment reached Victor before Damien could intervene, the scent curling around him and dimming the awareness in his eyes, his sword arm rising sluggishly toward his own allies instead of the enemy. Damien crossed the distance in an instant, struck Victor once, precisely, hard enough to drop him into unconsciousness, before the enchantment could force his hand any further. Better a bruise from a friend than a wound he'd never forgive himself for causing. Rebecca smiled at the sight, delighted by the small cruelty of it. How thoughtful, protecting him from himself. "You'll be the next thing I protect this forest from," Damien said. She came at him with poison-laced daggers and a second enchantment already forming on her lips, but Damien's authority of greed swallowed the spell before it finished, and the daggers themselves found nothing but empty air where he'd been standing a heartbeat earlier. He ended the exchange with the same soul-severing technique that had unraveled the mage at the mill, cutting the thread of dark magic sustaining her before her own blade could find purchase. A Yulon captain named Mustang pressed forward next, more disciplined than the others, clearly the operational leader of this ambush. He fought well, genuinely well, forcing Damien to actually commit to technique rather than idle deflection for the first time since the fight began. It didn't matter. Damien absorbed his opening gambit within 2 exchanges and turned it back against him, ending the captain's part in the ambush with brutal, efficient finality. Ernst remained the hardest problem. His body kept moving long after any ordinary man would have collapsed from exhaustion, driven forward by whatever curse had been layered into him. Damien searched for the source rather than simply cutting the man down, tracing the corrupted mana to a cluster of small, pulsing spheres embedded just beneath his collarbone, soul fragments, twisted into a leash. He crushed them with a precise strike that spared Ernst's life entirely. The knight collapsed the moment the compulsion broke, gasping, disoriented, tears already forming as fragments of his own actions began surfacing through the fog that had controlled him. A hidden bodyguard named Sebastian, who had spent the entire ambush concealed and watching rather than engaging, slipped away into the trees the moment the tide turned decisively against his employers. Damien let him go. There would be time to trace that thread later. By the time the forest fell quiet again, the convoy had lost 2 knights. Victor was beginning to stir with a headache and no memory of how he'd earned it, and Ernst knelt in the dirt beside the road, weeping over choices that had never truly belonged to him. Damien crouched beside him. The people who did this to you used her death as a weapon. Chelsea deserved better than what happened to her, and so did you. Find whoever's pulling these strings, and I promise you'll get the chance to make them answer for it. Ernst nodded, hollow but listening, something in him beginning, slowly, to knit itself back together. The convoy limped the rest of the way home, bruised but alive, and Damien rode at its head in silence, turning over everything the ambush had revealed. Yulon hadn't sent low-level enforcers this time. They'd sent a captain, an enchantress, and a corrupted knight, all working in coordination, all clearly answering to someone with far more resources than a single crime syndicate should have. Whoever orchestrated Chelsea's death and Ernst's unraveling wasn't finished. This had been a message, not a conclusion. Behind it all, Damien knew, weighted names he hadn't yet confronted directly. The Weapon Master's shadow stretching further than anyone in this timeline had realized. And beyond that shadow, still patient, still unseen, the Arch-Lich Dorgo, watching his old weapon rebuild a life he never intended for him to have. Damien didn't fear that reckoning. He'd already died once trying to stop it. Whatever came next, he intended to make certain it went differently this time. He rode through the gates of House Haxon as evening settled over the fields, Louise already waiting at the door, and for one quiet moment, let himself simply be grateful he had somewhere worth returning to at all.